The morning mist clung to the waters of New York Harbor like a shroud of impending doom, as Captain Samuel Hartwell of the Continental Marines squinted through his spyglass at the largest armada ever assembled in American waters. It was August 27th, 1776, and the sight before him would have made Neptune himself tremble with awe. Over 400 British vessels stretched across the horizon, their masts forming a forest of oak and canvas that seemed to swallow the very sky. Aboard these ships waited 32,000 of King George III's finest soldiers and Hessian mercenaries, the largest expeditionary force in British history. General William Howe commanded this massive war machine, determined to crush the American rebellion once and for all by seizing New York, the strategic heart of the colonial resistance. On the heights of Brooklyn, General George Washington paced nervously along the hastily constructed earthworks that formed the outer defenses of Long Island. His Continental Army, numbering barely 10,000 men, many of them militia who had never seen real combat, faced an enemy force more than 3 times their size. The weight of the revolution rested upon his shoulders, and he knew that a defeat here could spell the end of American independence before it had truly begun. The British had been planning this assault for months. After their humiliating evacuation from Boston earlier that year, they sought to demonstrate their overwhelming military superiority. New York's strategic position made it the perfect target. Controlling the city would effectively cut New England off from the southern colonies, dividing the rebellion and making it easier to defeat piecemeal. Washington's defensive strategy centered on Brooklyn Heights, the elevated ground that dominated the East River and Manhattan beyond. His engineers had constructed a series of fortifications stretching from Wallabout Bay to Gowanus Creek, anchored by Fort Putnam and Fort Greene. The Americans controlled from main passes through the wooded hills, the Gowanus Road, the Flatbush Road, the Bedford Road, and the Jamaica Road. General Israel Putnam commanded the American forces on Long Island, a grizzled veteran of the French and Indian War whose courage was matched only by his tactical limitations. Under him served Brigadier General John Sullivan, commanding the right wing, and Brigadier General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling, who held the left. These men understood that they faced not just a battle, but potentially the last stand of American liberty. The Hessian commander, General Leopold Philip D. Heister, had arrived with 8,000 German mercenaries whose reputation for discipline and ferocity preceded them. These professional soldiers, hired by King George to supplement his forces, brought with them the cold efficiency of European warfare. Their blue uniforms and gleaming bayonets represented everything the American colonists had come to fear about. Old world military might dot as the sun climbed higher on that fateful August morning. Both armies made their final preparations. The British had spent weeks gathering intelligence about American positions, utilizing loyalist informants and reconnaissance patrols. They knew exactly where Washington's weakest points lay, and General Howe had devised a plan that would exploit these vulnerabilities with devastating effect. The fate of nations hung in the balance as the greatest military confrontation in American history prepared to unfold on the fields and forests of Long Island. The pre-dawn darkness of August 27th, 1776, shrouded Long Island in an eerie silence that seemed to pulse with anticipation. In the American camp scattered across Brooklyn Heights, soldiers huddled around dying campfires, checking their muskets for the 100th time and whispering prayers to whatever gods might protect them in the coming storm. General George Washington had spent the sleepless night reviewing his defensive positions, acutely aware that his amateur army faced professional soldiers who had conquered half the known world. His continental forces were spread thin across a defensive line that stretched nearly 5 miles, from the marshy shores of Wallabout Bay to the muddy banks of Gowanus Creek. The weight of command pressed upon him like a physical burden as he contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead. According to historical accounts documented in David McCullough's comprehensive work on the Revolutionary War, the American defensive strategy relied heavily on the natural barriers provided by Long Island's terrain. The heights of Guam, a series of wooded hills running roughly parallel to the shoreline, formed the backbone of the colonial defense. These hills were pierced by 4 main roads that the British would need to use for any major assault: the coastal Gowanus Road on the left, the Flatbush Road in the center left, the Bedford Road in the center right, and the Jamaica Road on the far right. General Israel Putnam had positioned his forces to guard these crucial passes. On the extreme left, near the Gowanus Creek, Lord Sterling commanded approximately 1,600 men of the 1st Maryland Regiment and the Delaware Regiment. These were among Washington's best troops, disciplined Continental soldiers rather than militia. In the center, General John Sullivan held the Flatbush and Bedford passes with roughly 3,000 men, a mix of Continental troops and Pennsylvania militia. The Jamaica Road, furthest to the right, presented the greatest concern. This route offered the most direct path through the hills, yet it was guarded by only a small patrol of 5 officers and 15 men under Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Miles. Washington and his generals had assumed that the thick woods and difficult terrain would prevent any major British movement along this route, a miscalculation that would prove catastrophic. Meanwhile, in the British camps on Staten Island and aboard the fleet anchored in the Narrows, General William Howe put the finishing touches on his battle plan. The British commander had learned valuable lessons from the costly victory at Bunker Hill the previous year, where frontal assaults against entrenched Americans had resulted in horrific casualties. Among his elite troops, this time, he would employ the tactical sophistication that had made British arms supreme across 3 continents. Howe's strategy relied on deception and maneuver rather than brute force. He would launch diversionary attacks against the Gowanus at Flatbush Roads to fix American attention on the left and center, while secretly moving the main British force along the Jamaica Road to strike the American right flank and rear. It was a classic example of the tactical doctrine that had served British generals. From India to the Caribbean, the German mercenaries under General D. Heister would spearhead the diversionary attack on the Flatbush Road. Their disciplined formations and methodical advance designed to convince the Americans that this represented the main British assault. Simultaneously, a smaller force under General James Grant would demonstrate against Lord Sterling's position near Gowanus Creek, creating enough noise and movement to suggest a serious attack without committing significant resources. The masterstroke would come from General Henry Clinton, who would lead 10,000 men on a grueling night march around the American right flank via the Jamaica Road. This force included some of Britain's finest regiments, the light infantry, the grenadiers, and the elite guards battalions. Their objective was nothing less than the complete envelopment of the American army. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the morning mist, both armies stirred to life. The greatest battle of the Revolutionary War was about to begin. The thunder of artillery shattered the morning calm as General James Grant's diversionary force opened fire on Lord Sterling's positions near Gowanus Creek at precisely 9 o'clock. On the morning of August 27, 1776, the British guns, positioned on elevated ground near Red Hook, sent iron shots screaming over the marshland while Sterling's men crouched behind their hastily constructed earthworks, returning fire with whatever artillery pieces they possessed. Lord Sterling, born William Alexander in New York but claiming a Scottish peerage, commanded some of Washington's finest troops. The 1st Maryland Regiment, known as the Maryland 400, represented the cream of American military manpower. These men had trained relentlessly under European-style discipline, and their uniforms and equipment rivaled those of any professional army. Alongside them stood the Delaware Regiment, under Colonel John Haslett, equally well-trained and motivated by fierce devotion to the cause of independence. The feint succeeded brilliantly, as Grant's cannons roared and his scarlet-coated infantry formed menacing lines. Just out of musket range, Sterling became convinced that he faced the main British assault. He dispatched urgent messages to General Washington requesting reinforcements, warning that the enemy appeared to be massing for a major attack on the American left flank. Simultaneously, 5 miles to the northeast, General Leopold D. Heister's Hessians began their own diversionary movement against the Flatbush Road. The German mercenaries advanced with a mechanical precision that had made them the most feared soldiers in Europe. Their tall brass mitre caps gleamed in the morning sun as they formed perfectly aligned ranks, their synchronized movements creating an intimidating spectacle designed to terrify inexperienced American militia. General John Sullivan, commanding the American center, watched through his field glass as the blue-coated Hessians deployed into battle formation. The sight of these professional killers advancing with clockwork precision sent shivers through his largely untrained force of Pennsylvania and Delaware militia. Many of these men had never seen combat, and the psychological impact of facing Europe's most notorious mercenaries was immediately apparent in their nervous shuffling and whispered prayers. But the real danger was developing far from these noisy demonstrations. Throughout the previous night, General Henry Clinton had led 10,000 British regulars on a grueling 15-mile march around the American right flank. His route took them north from Flatlands, then west along the Jamaica Road toward Bedford, moving through territory that the Americans had left virtually unguarded. The British march had been a masterpiece of military coordination. Advanced scouts cleared the way while the main column moved in near-perfect silence, their equipment muffled and their officers maintaining iron discipline. Local loyalist guides, intimately familiar with every path and creek crossing, led the way through the darkness. By dawn, Clinton's massive force had reached Bedford Village, positioned directly behind the American right flank and completely undetected. At 8:30 in the morning, the trap snapped shut. Clinton's force struck the small American outpost at Bedford like a thunderbolt, overwhelming Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Miles's tiny patrol before they could fire more than a few scattered shots. The British light infantry and grenadiers, supported by artillery, swept through the village and began their advance toward the rear of Sullivan's main position. The sound of firing from Bedford sent shock waves through the American command. General Sullivan, already engaged with the Hessians to his front, suddenly realized that enemy forces had appeared in his rear. The tactical situations had collapsed with stunning suddenness. His 3,000 men were now trapped between Clinton's 10,000 advancing from the north and De Heister's Hessians pressing from the south. Panic began to spread through the American ranks as word of the disaster reached individual units. Many of the militia, realizing they faced encirclement and annihilation, simply abandoned their positions and fled toward the East River. Others, made of sterner stuff, attempted to maintain formation even as their tactical situation became hopeless. General Washington, monitoring the battle from his headquarters on Brooklyn Heights, received the devastating news with characteristic stoicism. The largest battle of the war had turned into a potential catastrophe for American arms, and the revolution itself hung in the balance as British steel closed around his trapped divisions. The morning of August 27, 1776, had transformed from hope to horror in the span of mere hours, as General John Sullivan's forces found themselves caught in the steel jaws of a British trap. From his command post near the Flatbush Road, Sullivan watched in growing alarm as reports flooded in of enemy forces, appearing where none should exist, shattering his carefully planned defensive positions like glass before a hammer. The collapse began with stunning swiftness. Clinton's flanking force, having swept through Bedford Village, now drove southward like an unstoppable avalanche of scarlet and steel. The British light infantry, elite troops selected for their speed and initiative, led the advance with fixed bayonets gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them came the grenadiers, tall men chosen for their physical prowess and fighting ability, their tall mitre caps making them appear even more intimidating. As they advanced in perfect formation, Sullivan's 3,000 men suddenly faced enemies on two fronts. To their south, General De Heister's Hessians continued their methodical advance, their blue uniforms and brass-fronted caps creating an image of inexorable Germanic efficiency. The mercenaries moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, each man maintaining exact distance from his neighbors, their officers barking commands in guttural German that sounded like death sentences to American ears. From the north came Clinton's devastating flanking force, 10,000 strong and advancing with the confidence of professional soldiers who knew they held every tactical advantage. The British had achieved what military theorists called envelopment, surrounding their enemy on multiple sides and cutting off all routes of retreat, except toward the East River, where certain death awaited any who tried to swim the treacherous currents under fire. The American militia, many of whom had never faced professional soldiers in open battle, began to break under the psychological pressure. These were farmers and merchants, blacksmiths and clerks brave enough when defending their homes, but unprepared for the terrifying reality of European-style warfare. The sight of disciplined enemy formations advancing from multiple directions, combined with the growing thunder of artillery and the distinctive whistle of musket balls overhead, shattered the nerve of hundreds of men simultaneously. Panic spread through the American ranks like wildfire. Entire companies simply dissolved as men threw down their muskets and ran toward the dubious safety of Brooklyn Heights. Officers struggled desperately to maintain order, but their inexperienced troops were beyond command or control. The carefully constructed American defensive line began to collapse section by section as units fled or were overwhelmed by superior numbers. Yet not all of Sullivan's men succumbed to panic. The Continental regiments, trained by European veterans, and stiffened by months of discipline, maintained their formation even as disaster engulfed their militia comrades. The 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment under Colonel John Shea and the Delaware Regiment under Colonel John Haslett fought with professional competence, conducting fighting withdrawals that slowed the British advance and allowed many of their fleeing comrades to escape. General Sullivan himself displayed remarkable personal courage as his command disintegrated around him. Mounting his horse, he rode between the fragmenting units of his division, attempting to rally men who had lost all confidence in their ability to resist the British war machine. His efforts were heroic, but ultimately futile. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery, and no amount of individual bravery could compensate for being outnumbered 3-1. While surrounded on multiple sides, the British advance gathered momentum with each passing hour. Their superior numbers allowed them to maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, while keeping substantial reserves for exploitation of any breakthrough. General Clinton, commanding the flanking force, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would later make him one of Britain's most successful commanders by coordinating his movements with the diversionary attacks to maintain maximum pressure on the collapsing American defense. By noon, the jaws of the British trap had nearly closed completely. Sullivan's surviving forces were compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket, their backs to the East River and their ammunition running dangerously low. The greatest military disaster in American history was unfolding with remorseless precision, and it seemed that nothing could prevent the complete destruction of a significant portion of Washington's army. While General Sullivan's command collapsed in chaos and confusion, a very different drama was unfolding along Gallinus Creek, where Lord Sterling's Maryland and Delaware regiments were about to write one of the most heroic chapters in American military history. The afternoon of August 27th, 1776, would witness a display of courage and sacrifice that would echo through the ages, as proof that citizen soldiers could stand toe-to-toe with the world's finest professional armies. Lord Stirling, born William Alexander, but claiming a disputed Scottish title, commanded what many considered the best trained troops in Washington's army. The 1st Maryland Regiment, known throughout the Continental Forces as the Maryland 400, had spent months drilling under the supervision of European veterans. Their scarlet facings and precise movements rivaled those of British regulars, while their motivation surpassed that of any mercenary force. As reports reached Stirling of the disaster of fallen Sullivan's division, the Maryland general faced an agonizing decision. His 1,600 men represented the flower of American military capability, trained at enormous expense and irreplaceable if lost. The logical course would be immediate retreat, to preserve these valuable troops for future battles. Instead, Stirling chose sacrifice over survival, duty over discretion. The tactical situation demanded nothing less than a suicidal rearguard action, with Sullivan's forces trapped and Clinton's flanking movement threatening to envelope the entire American army. Only a desperate holding action could buy time for the main force to escape across the East River. Stirling's men would have to stand and die to save their comrades, facing odds that made victory impossible and survival unlikely. The British forces closing in on Stirling's position represented some of the finest regiments in King George's army. General James Grant commanded the full brigades of Scottish Highlanders and English line regiments, supported by artillery and backed by the light dragoons of the 17th Regiment of Horse. These were veteran troops who had campaigned from the Caribbean to Canada, professionals who killed with the efficiency of butchers and the pride of aristocrats. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Maryland 400 received their orders. Major Mordecai Gist, a Baltimore merchant turned soldier, gathered his men around him and explained their mission with characteristic directness. They would attack the Vec House, a stone mansion that the British had converted into a strong point, buying time for Sullivan's survivors to escape while knowing that few of them would live to see another dawn. The assault that followed defied every principle of military science. 400 Americans advanced across open ground against 1,600 entrenched British regulars, their officers leading from the front with swords drawn and colors flying. The Maryland men moved with parade ground precision, their ranks dressed as if for inspection rather than slaughter, their faces set with the grim determination of men who had accepted death as the price of honor. British artillery opened fire as the Marylanders approached, sending solid shots screaming through their ranks and tearing gaps in their formation that were immediately closed by survivors stepping forward. Musket volleys followed, the distinctive crack of Brown Bess muskets creating a rolling thunder that echoed across the marshy ground. Men fell by the dozens, their blood staining the late summer grass. But the attack pressed forward with unshakable resolve. 5 separate times the Maryland 400 charged the stone house, and 5 times they were repulsed by superior numbers and defensive firepower. Each assault cost them men they could not afford to lose. But each attack also bought precious minutes for Sullivan's scattered forces. To reach the relative safety of Brooklyn Heights, Major Gist led every charge personally, his sword reflecting the afternoon sun as he urged his dwindling command forward into the teeth of British fire. The final assault came at sunset, when barely 60 survivors remained of the 400 who had begun the day. These men, many wounded and all exhausted, gathered around their colors for one last charge against impossible odds. Their attack was as hopeless as it was magnificent, a testament to the courage that transforms ordinary citizens into legendary warriors when their cause demands the ultimate sacrifice. General George Washington stood atop the ramparts of Fort Putnam as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on August 27, 1776, watching through his field glass as the flower of his army was systematically destroyed on the killing fields below. The sight of Lord Stirling's Maryland regiment making their final, desperate charges against the Vec Courthouse tore at his heart like a physical wound, forcing the normally stoic commander to witness the price of his tactical miscalculations. "Good God," Washington reportedly exclaimed to his aide-de-camp, "what brave fellows I must this day lose." The words, recorded by multiple witnesses, captured the anguish of a general who understood that his strategic errors had condemned hundreds of his finest soldiers to death or capture. The Maryland 400, the Delaware Regiment, and the remnants of Sullivan's division represented months of training and recruitment that could not be easily replaced in an army already stretched to its breaking point. The tactical disaster on Long Island had exposed every weakness in American military organization. The militia units, lacking the discipline and training necessary for conventional warfare, had collapsed under pressure from professional European armies. The Continental regiments, while individually brave and well-trained, were few in number to hold extensive defensive lines against superior forces. Most critically, Washington's intelligence network had failed completely, allowing Clinton's massive flanking movement to proceed undetected until it was too late to respond effectively. As darkness began to fall, the full magnitude of the defeat became apparent. General Sullivan had been captured along with hundreds of his men, taken prisoner when his horse was shot from under him during the retreat. Lord Stirling, after fighting with legendary courage throughout the afternoon, had also fallen into British hands when the remnants of his command were finally overwhelmed. The cream of the Continental Army lay dead on the battlefield or marched away in chains, while British casualties remained remarkably light. General William Howe, commanding the victorious British forces, had achieved everything he had hoped for, and more. His tactical masterpiece had inflicted devastating losses on the rebel army while demonstrating British military superiority in the most convincing possible manner. The largest battle of the Revolutionary War had ended in complete triumph for royal arms, opening the path to New York City and potentially ending the rebellion before it could gain momentum. Yet Washington understood that total disaster could still be averted if he acted quickly and decisively. The surviving elements of his army, perhaps 7,000 men, remained trapped on Brooklyn Heights with their backs to the East River. British naval superiority meant that Admiral Richard Howe's fleet could move up the river at any time, cutting off all retreat and forcing the complete surrender of American forces. Only immediate evacuation could prevent the capture of the entire Continental Army. The decision to retreat across the East River represented one of the most difficult moments of Washington's military career. Abandoning Long Island meant surrendering all hope of holding New York, the strategic key to the Middle Colonies. It meant admitting that his army could not stand against British regulars in open battle, a devastating blow to American morale and international credibility. Most painfully, it meant leaving behind the wounded and the dead, men who had trusted him with their lives and paid the ultimate price for his tactical failures. Throughout the night of August 29th to 30th, 1776, one of the most remarkable military operations in American history unfolded under cover of darkness and fog. Washington's quartermaster, Colonel Joseph Reed, had assembled every available boat, barge, and ferry from Manhattan and the surrounding waters. The evacuation would require perfect coordination and complete silence, as British sentries were positioned less than 100 yards from American lines. The operation succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. Regiment by regiment, the Continental Army slipped away from Brooklyn Heights in complete silence, their movements masked by a providential fog that rolled in from the harbor. Artillery pieces had their wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, while officers whispered orders and men moved like ghosts through the pre-dawn darkness. By sunrise on August 30th, the entire American force had vanished from Long Island, leaving only empty trenches and abandoned campfires to greet the advancing British. The morning of August 30th, 1776, dawned gray and misty over Brooklyn Heights as British and Hessian soldiers cautiously approached the American fortifications, expecting to find a trapped army ready for surrender. Instead, they discovered empty trenches and cold campfires, the only evidence of one of the most skillful military evacuations in history. General William Howe's moment of total victory had slipped away in the fog, like smoke through his fingers, leaving him master of an empty battlefield rather than captor of the Continental Army. The Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn, had ended in devastating defeat for American arms. Yet somehow Washington's forces had lived to fight another day. The statistics told a grim story. American casualties exceeded 1,500 men killed, wounded, or captured, including two general officers and numerous regimental commanders. British losses numbered fewer than 400, a testament to their tactical superiority and the completeness of their victory. Among the prisoners marched away in chains were some of the finest officers in American service. General John Sullivan, despite his brave conduct during the battle, would spend months in British captivity before being exchanged. Lord Stirling, the gallant commander, whose Maryland regiment had died to save their comrades, faced similar imprisonment. These losses deprived Washington of experienced leadership at a time when competent generals were desperately scarce. The political consequences of the defeat reverberated throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic. In London, news of Howe's victory was received with jubilation, as members of Parliament declared the rebellion effectively crushed. King George III himself expressed satisfaction that his armies had demonstrated British military superiority in such convincing fashion. European observers, particularly in France and Spain, began to question whether supporting American independence represented a worthwhile investment of resources and prestige. Within the colonies, the psychological impact proved equally severe. Many Americans had believed that their citizen soldiers, fighting for liberty on their native soil, possessed inherent advantages over professional armies fighting for pay and empire. The systematic destruction of Continental forces on Long Island shattered these illusions, forcing colonists to confront the reality that independence would require far greater sacrifices than initially anticipated. Yet the very completeness of British victory contained the seeds of future American success. General Howe's tactical masterpiece had demonstrated exactly what the Continental Army needed to avoid in future engagements. The lessons learned on Long Island would inform Washington's strategy for the remainder of the war: avoid major battles against superior forces, preserve the army at all costs, and gradually wear down British resolve through extended conflict, rather than decisive confrontations. The evacuation itself became a source of inspiration that partially offset the sting of defeat. Washington's ability to save his army from certain destruction demonstrated the kind of leadership that could sustain resistance through the darkest hours. The story of the mysterious fog that aided the retreat took on almost supernatural significance in popular imagination, convincing many Americans that divine providence favored their cause despite temporary setbacks. More importantly, the battle had revealed both American weaknesses and potential strengths. The militia had proven unreliable in conventional warfare, but the Continental regiments had fought with remarkable courage and discipline. The Maryland 400's heroic sacrifice became a rallying cry that inspired recruitment and boosted morale throughout the southern colonies. Their example proved that American soldiers could match European professionals in courage, if not in numbers or equipment. The strategic situation remained precarious as British forces occupied New York City and prepared to extend their control throughout the Hudson Valley. Washington's army, despite its narrow escape, was demoralized and depleted, while British confidence soared to dangerous heights. The revolution hung by the thinnest of threads. As autumn approached and the campaigning season drew toward its close, yet Something had changed in those desperate hours on Long Island. The Continental Army had tasted defeat, but survived to learn from it. Washington had experienced his greatest failure, but emerged with clearer understanding of how to wage war against the world's most powerful empire. The path to independence remained long and uncertain, but the first great test had been survived, and with survival came the possibility of eventual victory. The Battle of Long Island had ended in British triumph, but it had not ended the American Revolution. Instead, it had transformed a colonial rebellion into something harder and more durable, a people's war that would continue until one side or the other could no longer bear the cost of resistance.